Montana 1882. Go faster. Caleb Morrison had encountered many challenges in his 22 years. He had been thrown by a horse 3 times before managing to stay mounted. He had endured a Montana winter in a solitary line shack, subsisting only on dried beans and sheer determination. At 16, he survived a cattle stampede that gave him a scar on his left forearm and a tale he never told well. Still, nothing prepared him for the front porch of the Reed Ranch. On a Thursday morning in October, he stood at the gate, hat in hand, his heart pounding irrationally in his chest. Gazing at the house where Frank Reed was undoubtedly inside, he contemplated retreat. For 3 months, he had considered turning back every single day. Frank Reed, a Montana rancher of 55 years, stood 1.88 meters tall, with a beard that had grayed prematurely. His eyes had the look of someone who had witnessed enough to recognize precisely what he saw. He was the sort of man others call fair. What they really meant was that he was fair, like the weather is fair, consistently unemotional and utterly indifferent to your opinion. Caleb, aged 22, possessed a horse, a saddle, a quality knife, and roughly $14. He earned wages on the Henderson Ranch, located nearly 10 kilometers east, which offered decent pay for seasonal work, but nothing during winter. By any sensible standard, he was far too poor for Frank Reed's daughter. He was aware of this, and had been for the whole 3 months. He had attempted not to fall in love with Annie Reed, a task roughly as effective as trying to ignore the dawn. He pushed open the gate, strode to the porch, and knocked. Frank Reed opened the door, fixing him with that gaze. Then Caleb Morrison spoke the most honest and terrifying words he had ever uttered to anyone. "Mr. Reed, I wish to talk to you about Annie." It had begun the way most things in Caleb's life began, with a fence, to be precise. The boundary fence between the Henderson and Reed properties had a stretch that collapsed each spring. In the spring of 1882, that stretch fell on the Henderson side. Technically, that made it Henderson's responsibility, so Caleb was the one repairing it. On a May morning, he had been working for 2 hours, hammering posts into ground still soft from snowmelt. Hearing someone on the other side, he looked up. Annie Reed, 19, had dark, wavy hair tied in a loose braid. She possessed the characteristic directness of someone raised knowing precisely where objects were and how they functioned. She was inspecting the Reed fence, her side section which had also fallen. That meant she was handling her father's fence work on a Saturday morning and asked. Caleb took note. "Henderson's side," she greeted. He replied, "Yes, our side is down too." She examined the damage with the critical eye of an experienced fence fixer. "That post has been rotting since last autumn. Papa kept promising to see to it." "I can fix your side too while I'm here," Caleb offered. She gave him an unreadable look. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he replied. He repaired the Henderson side, then the Reed side. Halfway through, she brought him water, which he accepted. They chatted for 20 minutes about the fence, the flat, the Henderson cattle, and whether spring would arrive early or late. Riding home that evening, he knew he was already in trouble. He saw her 4 more times before June, always from afar, always briefly. Each time he left feeling like a man who had lingered too close to a flame, and he hadn't stepped back when he ought. By July, he had given up pretending this would sort itself out without him. Ruth Reed, married to Frank for 28 years, had honed over time a particular talent for noticing things. Her husband would need 3 weeks to figure it out alone. She spotted Caleb Morrison when he first visited the Reed property, not to talk to Frank, not yet. He was merely passing by on an errand for Henderson that conveniently brought him within speaking range of the front porch where Annie was shelling peas. Ruth observed from the kitchen window. She saw him remove his hat when addressing Annie. She saw him truly listen when Annie spoke, not just waiting for his turn. She observed him laugh at something Annie said, a sincere laugh that caught him off guard. She also watched Annie watch him immediately. That evening at supper, she said nothing. Frank discussed the North pasture and beef prices in Billings. Ruth listened, gave fitting responses, but pondered the young man who removed his hat and listened. Eventually, Frank remarked, "Annie was talking to that Henderson hand today." Ruth said. "Young Morrison? I believe." Frank glanced at her. After 28 years, he knew Ruth's held around 14 distinct meanings. This particular one signaled that she knew something he did not. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "Pass the bread." Frank handed the bread with the look of a man who realizes he is lagging in information and is uncertain how to close the gap. Ruth buttered her bread with the calm of a woman who had already determined the story's conclusion. She was simply waiting for the others to catch up. October came, and Caleb exhausted his excuses to delay. Over the summer, he had invented legitimate pretexts to linger near the Reed property. Fence repairs, cattle inquiries, and returning a tool Henderson had borrowed from Frank years earlier. A loan Henderson had completely forgotten. Each encounter with Annie brought good conversation, and each departure made him more certain and more terrified. In September, Annie met his gaze across the Reed kitchen table. Ruth had invited him for coffee after he helped haul in a fence section that had collapsed in a storm. Ruth orchestrated the invitation with the precision of a woman who knows precisely her purpose. She stated simply, "You always find a reason to come by the fences." He answered, "The fences are fine, Caleb," and then looked at his coffee. "Yes," he admitted, "I always find a reason." She smiled at him with an expression that posed no question, so in October he arrived, hat in hand. He had $14 and the unique fear of a young man who has resolved to do the right thing, no matter the outcome. Frank opened the door, eyed him without a word. "Miss Reed," Caleb said, "I wish to speak with you about Annie." For a long moment, Frank stared at him before stepping aside and inviting him in. They took seats at the kitchen table. Ruth came in with coffee that she had obviously prepared beforehand, indicating she had anticipated this visit, a fact that Caleb found both soothing and unsettling. He spoke directly, as that was his only way. "I care about Annie, and I would like to court her properly, with your permission." His gaze dropped to the table. "I realize I'm not wealthy enough for your daughter, Mr. Reed. I own no land, have no savings, and can offer little besides hard work and honesty." He paused, then continued. "I would devote my entire life to ensuring she never regrets her choice." The kitchen fell silent. Frank Reed studied the young man before him, the frayed shirt, the hat, and his hands. The $14 he had were all he possessed, evident in the lack of any other belongings. Frank remained silent long enough for Caleb's heart to race with various anxieties. Then Frank spoke. "She needs a decent man, not a wealthy one. But I won't give you my answer today." He fixed his calm, fair-weather gaze on Caleb. "First, I'll give you something, and we'll see how you handle it." What Frank offered was this. The Harlan property, located 13 kilometers north, was the toughest ranching land in the entire county. Old Jim Harlan passed away in August, leaving the ranch to his 19-year-old son, who had no experience. Without assistance, he would lose all the cattle over the winter, so Frank had agreed to provide a worker. "You'll stay there for the winter," Frank stated. "No pay, the boy can't afford it. Work from October to March, then return in spring." Caleb looked at him and said, "If I do that, then we'll discuss it," replied Frank. That wasn't a yes, nor was it a promise. Caleb fully understood that this was the intention. He agreed before Frank even completed his statement. Frank observed this but gave no sign. Ruth, topping up coffee that was already full, also noticed. Her reaction was far less restrained, though Frank deliberately avoided looking at her. Annie overheard everything from the hallway. Although not invited to join the discussion, she listened from about 2 meters away. When Caleb emerged, she stood by the door with a look mixing worry and pride. "The Harlan place," she murmured. "Yes," he replied. "It's tough terrain, I'm aware. Jim Harlan had exhausted 2 hired hands and a foreman over a decade. I know that as well." She gazed at him briefly, then spoke softly, so Frank wouldn't overhear from the kitchen. "Return in spring." It wasn't a declaration or a promise, merely an instruction. She spoke with the assurance of someone who had already made up her mind and was simply notifying the concerned parties. Caleb put on his hat, walked to his horse, and rode north. From the kitchen window, Ruth Reed watched him leave and remarked to nobody. He agreed before Frank even finished his sentence. Frank, standing behind her, remained silent, but he too was observing. Before continuing, I'd like to pause briefly. From the United States to Australia, Canada to the UK, Ireland to New Zealand, wherever you are, thank you for joining us. If this story is making your evening enjoyable, a like is greatly appreciated. Now, which country are you tuning in from today? Type it in the comments now. Let's return to Caleb Morrison, who is about to discover his true character. The Harlan property was exactly as described. Harsh, rocky, exposed terrain that caught every wind sweeping down from the Canadian border. With no natural barrier, the barn required repairs. The cattle had been poorly managed. Old Jim had given his best in his final years, but his best was fading. Young Thomas Harlan, 19 years old, earnest and utterly overwhelmed, welcomed Caleb on the first day. With the look of a drowning man who spots a rope, Thomas introduced himself. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "That's fine," Caleb replied. "I do." What Caleb hadn't anticipated was how much Thomas mirrored his younger self, not in situation, but in character. The same readiness to acknowledge ignorance, the same drive to acquire knowledge, the same awareness that the land was indifferent to emotions, and the sole appropriate reaction was to be attentive and continue working. He discovered a patience within himself he hadn't known existed. Not out of obligation, but because Thomas deserved someone who would show up and remain. Never did he make Thomas feel foolish for lacking knowledge. After all, Thomas had never had a teacher. By November, Thomas could interpret weather signs well enough to relocate cattle ahead of a storm. By December, he grasped the feeding rotation. By January, he was handling half the work without guidance. Caleb sent Annie 2 letters, brief and matter-of-fact. Her replies were longer, painting a picture of the Reed Ranch in winter, snow descending from the mountain, snippets of her mother's comments that made them both giggle. She carefully selected each word. He could sense it. She wrote as one writes, when wanting the reader to experience the scene, not merely read about it. He read her letters 4 times each, though he never admitted this to her. February brought the winter's fiercest storm sweeping down from Canada. Caleb worked for 36 consecutive hours relocating cattle and repairing a collapsed fence. In conditions where breathing froze, he prevented Thomas from making 3 choices that could have lost the herd. Once it was over, he sat in the Harlan kitchen, sipping the worst coffee he'd ever had. He thought, this young man will be fine. Then, someday, I want a son like him. Then he ceased thinking and fell asleep. Frank Reed did not remain inactive that winter. He asked questions subtly. Frank Reed did nothing overtly. With the deliberate patience of a man conducting an unannounced investigation, he inquired about Caleb from Henderson. Anderson reported that Caleb was the best hired hand he had employed in 5 years, and the only one who repaired things without needing a second request. Frank took note. He asked Jim Harlan's neighbor, Pete Connell, how young Morrison was faring up north. Pete said he had ridden by the Harlan property in December, and the cattle appeared healthier than they had in 3 years. Moreover, the Harlan lad had been working the fence line in weather that would keep most people indoors. Frank also noted that he mentioned none of this to Ruth. Ruth, with her own network, already knew everything Frank had discovered, plus several details he hadn't. She too kept silent. 28 years of marriage had taught her when to speak and when to allow a man to reach conclusions independently. What Frank was doing, though he wouldn't phrase it this way, was assembling a case in favor of Caleb, not against him. He gathered evidence as he always did, meticulously, unhurriedly, ensuring the foundation was solid. Because Frank Reed understood something Caleb hadn't yet grasped. The test was never truly about the Harlan property. It was about how a man behaves when there's no guarantee, when the answer may be no, when the work is grueling and the winter endless, and when no one owes him anything. It was a test of his character. Frank, who prided himself on accurate judgment of men, believed he already knew the outcome, yet he chose to wait until spring regardless. Because certain matters require completion before they can be verified. Also, Ruth had already told him 3 times that he was being stubborn. He had replied equally often that he was being thorough. Neither was completely mistaken. Caleb returned to the Reed Ranch on 15 March. Snow still covered the high peaks, but the valley displayed the first hints of spring green. The creek between the Henderson and Reed properties flowed full and clear, just as it had the morning he repaired the fence and first met Annie. He had left in October with $14, and he returned with the same amount. The Harlan work had offered no pay, as agreed. He had spent the winter sustaining himself, Thomas, and 60 head of cattle rather than building wealth. He was conscious of the $14, yet he rode to the Reed Ranch regardless. Frank was on the porch, as though he had not moved since October. Only now he wore a lighter jacket, and the mountains behind him had shifted in color. Caleb tied his horse at the gate, approached the porch, and stood in the same spot as in October. "Mr. Reed," he said. Frank studied him for a lengthy moment. "Pete Connell informs me that the Harlan cattle emerged from winter in better condition than they have been for years," Frank said. "Thomas worked hard," Caleb replied. "He learned quickly. Pete also says you repaired the north fence during the February storm, and it had required fixing for 36 hours. Frank fell silent for a moment. He said, "You still have nothing." "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, admitting he still had nothing. "And you're still here?" "Yes, sir." Frank Reed studied the young man before him, 22 years old, weathered by a severe winter, with only $14 and a horse, standing on his porch in March. His expression suggested he had completed his task without claiming it was simple or seeking praise. Inside, he felt a change if asked. He would call it satisfaction. "Come inside," he said. "Ruth has coffee." It wasn't a definitive yes, but for Frank Reed, it was the nearest he'd get until he felt prepared. The coffee was excellent. Ruth's coffee always was. Caleb had noticed this back in October and noticed it again now, and he commented on it. That prompted Ruth to look at him with the same expression she'd had ever since the conversation about the fence. That expression in May belonged to a woman whose judgments had been vindicated time and again, leaving her unsurprised. The 3 of them, Frank, Ruth, and Caleb, sat around the kitchen table. A silence filled the room, laden with unspoken meanings. Then Ruth spoke. "Annie's been in correspondence with you." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied. He explained that she had written 6 letters and he had responded with 4. "I wasn't sure what number would be suitable." Ruth glanced at Frank, who was staring into his coffee. "It was appropriate," Ruth stated. A further pause. "The Harlem boy," Frank said. "Thomas, how is he prepared for the next winter?" "He'll manage," Caleb answered. "He knows his work now. He might require assistance with the northern fence before October. That part will collapse again, but his cattle management skills are solid." Frank gave a slow nod. "You taught him, and he learned quickly." Caleb repeated, "You keep saying that." Frank then noted that the young man had learned fast and the cattle had survived because of Thomas's hard work. He met Caleb's gaze directly. "You don't claim credit for anything." Caleb stared at the table. "It doesn't feel proper to." Frank remained silent for an extended period, so long that Ruth topped up everyone's coffee. She moved with the calm of someone who knows the outcome and is merely waiting for the final chapter. Then Frank spoke. "I built this ranch from scratch 28 years ago. I had a horse, a saddle, Ruth, and roughly the same amount of money you have now." Caleb lifted his gaze. "Ruth's father considered me too poor for her," Frank said. "He was right, technically, I was." He looked at his coffee again. "He gave me 1 year to demonstrate otherwise. I spent that year laboring on his land without pay." He paused. "I thought you deserved to know that." The kitchen fell utterly silent. Ruth gazed out the window with a particular expression, one that belonged to a woman who had waited 28 years for her husband to share that story with the appropriate listener. Caleb Morrison, seated at the kitchen table, grasped with the sharp clarity of a young man whose worldview is being reshaped. The test had never originated from Frank. It was simply the only way Frank knew how to offer something. Frank delivered his answer that afternoon, not in a formal manner, because Frank Reed never operated formally. He communicated it as he conveyed everything, directly, without embellishment, while engaged in another activity. After lunch, they stood on the porch gazing at the valley. "You'll need to secure work for the summer," Frank said. "Henderson will take you back by autumn. You'll have saved enough for a beginning." Caleb looked at him. "The south pasture on this property hasn't been properly grazed in 2 years." Frank went on. "A man who knew his business could run 20 head of cattle there this season without overcrowding the main herd." He paused. "That man would need to negotiate terms with me." "What sort of terms?" Caleb inquired cautiously. "Fair ones," Frank replied. Caleb realized he was being offered a start, not a gift, but a proposal with conditions, which was the proper approach, and he recognized it. "Yes, sir," he answered. "I'd like that." Frank nodded once and then went inside. Annie emerged from around the corner of the house roughly 40 seconds later, indicating she had been eavesdropping. Caleb had assumed as much, and it made him smile. "In a way, he couldn't fully control the south pasture," she said. 20 head, he said. She regarded him with the same expression she wore at the fence. "In May, he told you about his father-in-law." "Yes," she confirmed. "Mama said he'd tell you when he was ready." She paused. "She's been waiting 8 months." He laughed, and she laughed. The Montana spring embraced them both. The mountains, the fresh grass, the clear creek flowing between their lands. That winter he wrote her 6 letters. Years later, she would tell him she had written 6 as well. She had counted. He held her hand for the first time, standing in the reed yard under the March sun. She accepted it with the effortless ease of something that has discovered its rightful spot. "I still have $14, he said. "I know," she replied. "You'll have more by September." "Is that enough time?" he asked. She met his gaze with Annie Reed's eyes direct, fearless, and utterly confident. "It's exactly enough time," she stated. They were married in September 1882, on a Saturday, at the Millbrook Church. Ruth Reed wept from the front pew, displaying the unapologetic satisfaction of a woman whose judgments had proven accurate for 18 months. Frank Reed stood beside her, his face showing a man deeply moved, though he wished to conceal it. Everyone saw through it instantly, and Frank knew it. He resolved to bear it with dignity. Caleb, wearing his best shirt, stood at the altar watching Annie approach. His mind wandered to a fence in May, a porch in October, and a Montana winter that sometimes felt interminable. And he realized that every single day had been completely worthwhile. Annie wore a cream-colored dress her mother had sewn. Her dark hair perfectly styled, she moved with the confidence of a woman who had long known her destination. They lived on the Reed property that first year, under the South Pasture arrangement with Frank, which in the spring evolved into a partnership one neither had formally proposed, but both knew was inevitable. Caleb was the type of man who repaired things without needing to be asked twice. The ranch operations were far better managed by the next spring. Frank observed this, said nothing outright, but started seeking Caleb's input on decisions in a manner that wasn't exactly asking for advice, but wasn't entirely ignoring it either. Ruth noticed this pattern and remained silent, which required great self-control. Their son was born in June 1883, and they named him Thomas. When Ruth heard the name, she glanced at Caleb, saying nothing. But her face conveyed everything. Frank explained that Thomas was named after the Harlan boy. Caleb simply said he deserved something. Frank paused for a moment, then agreed. "Good name." Thomas entered the world with his father's dark curly hair and his mother's direct stare. From the very first moment, Frank Reed held him while standing in the bedroom doorway. He looked at the tiny person who had arrived with the unique presence of someone who intends to stay. Something shifted in Frenchcombe. Something Ruth had witnessed only a handful of times in 28 years. He softened, not obviously, not theatrically, but Ruth caught it. The particular tenderness of a man who had been resilient for so long. He was discovered in the weight of the child in his arms, something that doesn't demand strength. He held Thomas for a long while in silence, then looked at Caleb, who was standing by the window observing him. Then he uttered, "Good boy!" Caleb knew he wasn't referring to Thomas. That summer, on a Sunday afternoon, the Reed property was bustling as it hadn't been since Annie was little. Frank sat on the porch with Thomas on his lap, talking to the baby. He addressed the child with the seriousness of a man who has decided that this person merits genuine conversation. Ruth stood in the doorway, watching with the same expression she'd had since May of the previous year. Caleb and Annie were together in the yard. The Montana mountains continued their eternal presence, and the creek flowed clear between the properties. Frank Reed, who had once tested a young man with a harsh winter, $14 and no guarantees, now sat on his porch with his grandson, and was, from every possible assessment he could make, he was fully content with the outcome. Frank Reed made Caleb Morrison endure the toughest winter of his life, without pay, without security, without any assurance that a yes awaited at the end. It was simply labor. Simply the trial, simply the inquiry into what a person does when no one owes them anything. And Caleb, aged 22, in a share worth $14, said yes before Frank had even finished his sentence. That instant is what counts, not the wedding, not the South Pasture transaction, not even the spring when Frank revealed Ruth's father. The crucial moment was that split second between the conclusion of Frank's proposal and the start of Caleb's reply, when a young man who possessed nothing faced a harsh winter without any promise and still agreed. Because that is what true character resembles before it has any evidence to demonstrate it. Frank Reed understood this. He had experienced it himself 28 years earlier, on a different property with a different father-in-law who offered him the same present, not a simple acceptance, but the opportunity to prove what he was made of. The most valuable asset Caleb Morrison brought to the Reed family was not what he constructed during the summer of 1882. It was his actions in the winter, when conditions were freezing and difficult, when no one observed, and when the only reward was the labor itself. Ruth had recognized this since May. Frank had known it from the instant Caleb agreed before the sentence was completed. Annie had perceived it from the fence line in the spring. Certain individuals, when they arrive fully from the very start, and those who love them and pay attention notice it straight away. Everything else is merely time passing. If you reach the conclusion of this narrative, I sincerely thank you from my heart. These stories exist because of you, every remark, every endorsement, every person who shares an episode with a loved one. That is what sustains this. No matter your location today in the United States, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, or Ireland. In New Zealand, I trust that Caleb, Annie, Frank, and Ruth provided you with something comforting to hold. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until our next meeting, go on composing,